Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is Zach Workowich. I'm with History Colorado at El Pueblo History Museum. Tonight's event is part of History Colorado's Borderlands of Southern Colorado speaker series, offered by History Colorado Museums, El Pueblo History Museum, Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, Trinidad History Museum, and the Ute Indian Museum. Before we begin tonight's program, in the spirit of healing and education, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners. We consult with them when we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs. We recognize these indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this land. As always, I'd like to thank the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area and Colorado State University Pueblo for their continued support of this series. History Colorado members can deepen their involvement and support the Borderlands of Southern Colorado initiative by joining Fronteras, the Borderlands of Southern Colorado Society. By making a contribution to join Fronteras, you are connecting with others who share your special interest in the understanding and scholarship of the Borderlands. You can find more information and join Fronteras at h-co.org/Fronteras. Tonight's talk is Creating Community at a Global Crossroads, presented by Dr. Maria Montoya. Dr. Montoya is a Global Network Associate Professor of History at New York University and the Dean of Arts and Sciences at NYU Shanghai. She earned her BA, MA, and PhD degrees at Yale University. She's the author of numerous articles on the history of the American West, environmental, labor, and Latina history, and of the book Translating Property, the Maxwell Land Grant and the Conflict over Land in the American West, 1840 to 1900. She's the lead author on the US history textbook, Global Americans, A Social and Global History of the United States. Her new book, Making the Working Man's Paradise, Progressive Management of Workers and Their Families in Colorado's Coal Fields, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. It focuses on John D. Rockefeller and Josephine Roche and their roles in defining the spheres of work and home life during the early 20th century. Dr. Montoya, thank you. It's wonderful to finally have you. I know we've had you scheduled to come to Pueblo a couple times, and pandemics and snowstorms have not allowed it to work out, but I'm so happy that you're here with us tonight. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Zach. And thank you for having me and being patient. And I'm glad this is finally worked out for us. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, Zach, if you can allow that. Okay, great. You are all getting an insight to what every Zoom class is like across the country. So great. Okay, here we go. Well, great. As I said, thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and thank you so much to History Colorado and to all the folks who have been patient as we put this together. What I'm going to do tonight is talk for just about 40 minutes or so. Hopefully, I won't go beyond that. I really want to get questions from all of you. And I want to kind of take sort of a real bird's eye view of the history of Southern Colorado and the other side of northern New Mexico, and think about this particular region, a place that I've come from, that you all live in, and think about how it fits into a global context. And these days I'm really always thinking about how I fit into a global context, into a global world, and I'm thinking about how the place I come from fits into that context. And that's really been brought home to me the last few years. I've been the Dean of Arts and Sciences at NYU Shanghai, and it's been just an incredible experience for me. And I shared a little bit about that earlier with the Fronteras group when we met. And so I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that if people have questions about NYU Shanghai, how somebody from, Colorado and southern Colorado ended up, halfway across the world, and why I find it to be such an interesting and a place that has many connections to the other place that I call home here in New Mexico and Colorado. And these are just a few photos of our students in our building at NYU Shanghai. The other way that I come to this idea of thinking about globalizing is through the textbook that I wrote with four of my other colleagues called Global Americans. And the idea behind this textbook was really to get students, college students, particularly students at community colleges, to see themselves within the history of the United States and to see themselves within a larger world history context. And the idea behind Global Americans is very much, you see all these photos on the cover of the book, is the idea is that we all come from somewhere, with the exception of Native Americans. We've all come to this place we call Colorado, New Mexico, the United States from someplace else. And we all have this kind of connection. And so the book seeks to tell the history of the United States from that perspective, rather than from a sort of an East Coast centric perspective that looks from the East to the West. Rather, again, it takes a sort of bird's eye view of the continent of North America and the United States. And the way I explain to most people about why my textbook, our textbook, is different is to compare the kinds of maps that historians use to tell the history of the United States. This is a very typical map of the United States that you would see in most US history textbooks. This one happens to come from People in a Nation, one of the best-selling textbooks in the United States. And it's exactly what you would expect, right? It's a disembodied image of the United States. It has no connections to anything else. Off on the side, it has a picture of Alaska and Hawaii. It's got the territories on the bottom, but there's no sense of any real connection. And in most US history textbooks, this is the way that people think about how they themselves fit in the history of the nation. And one of the moves we made in our textbook is that we completely decentered that notion, and instead we showed a map of a global world where the United States is sort of put into its global context. And the idea behind this is from the very beginning to get students to decenter themselves, to rethink about their place in the world. And then in fact, maybe the United States is not the center of the world. And I think actually today, most college students know that. They've come from different places, their families have come from different places, and they're trying to find a sense of themselves within their own history of the United States. And our hope was with that textbook that we would be able to answer those students and help them find their history in the United States. So that gives you a little context about how I'm thinking about this region that we call Southern Colorado and Northern New Mexico. And I'll kind of just flip to that now. So you have to look at my pictures of Hoover. We'll flip through that for now. So I want to sort of juxtapose these two narratives of Southern Colorado. I think, often people thought of this region as completely isolated, right? It was an arid and an empty landscape. I think to some extent, capitalists from the East Coast, whether it was the managers of CF&I or the managers of the Maxwell Land Grant, always saw this region as something that was empty. I mean, maybe there were Native Americans, if those even sort of, floated to the top of their imaginations, but it was not for them a place that they saw as settled, a place that had a community, a place that had its own sense of trade networks and an economy. And so I think that's a narrative that's very much stuck with this region, even through the 20th century. We see it as someplace that's other, that's not sort of internal to the workings of the nation. And so consequently, we've told a story about this region that's very much about Native American communities who are being replaced by particular kinds of settlers, whether it's the French fur traders, Spanish, the Mexicans, and later the Americans. Instead of seeing what I think it really is this place of connection, this place of a crossroads where all different kinds of people are coming together. From the very beginning, long before Europeans showed up, there was a thriving Native American community that was based on the bison hunt, in which people collaborated with each other other, in which they came into conflict with one another. But no matter how you looked at it, this was a very, very rich place of collaboration and communication, and a crossroads, if you will. And so what I want to do tonight is just sort of look at three particular historical moments to sort of explore this idea of this region as a crossroads. I'm going to spend just a few minutes to talk about the early 19th century and talk about the idea of national exploration and the emergence of the fur trade in southern Colorado. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about the coal mining communities that emerged at the late 19th and early part of the 20th century. And then I want to spend just a little bit of time at the end talking about a new kind of crossroads, a kind of ideological crossroads that happens in the 1920s as a result of immigrants who've come into the southern Colorado to work in the coal camps, and the kind of industrial violence and anti-communism and anti-foreign sentiment that really had a rise in the 1920s. And hopefully I'll be able to do that all in about 30 minutes. So let's just talk a little bit about exploration and empire. And the reason why I want to start, back in the 19th century is just to give you this sense of continuity, that again, that this is always, southern Colorado has always been a place where different kinds of peoples have come together to trade, to interact with one another, to marry one another, to create families together in this place. And the idea of exploration, US exploration, really occurs about the same time that the North American fur trade industry and business is coming to full flow during this period. It's also the period when the United States is looking from the east to the west to see how far it can expand. They want to know what's out there, past the Appalachian Mountains. And so these early expeditions that are sent out into the American West and into Colorado in particular are meant to do things like find geographic knowledge, actually understand the landscape that is out there beyond the Pale, to create trade with nations, Native Americans and Indians, to create a sort of economic bond with them, and also to sort of check out all the other European powers that are out there. Certainly the United States know that they're the French, the Spanish are out there, even the Russians are up in California. And part of what Jefferson and the nation are envisioning is a coast-to-coast nation. And in order for that to happen, they really need to get some reconnaissance and some information and find that out. And so I want to just take a couple minutes to talk about, in particular, the explorations of Zebulon Pike through the American Southwest, and particularly through Colorado. And I just want to compare him a little bit because he's very contemporaneous with what's going on with Lewis and Clark and the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so you can take a little look at this map here. This is the Lewis and Clark expedition that's going through here. And at the same time, Pike does two explorations, one up the Mississippi River, and the most famous one, and the one that we know him for, of course, is the one through Colorado, where he's captured, eventually brought through Mexico, and then sent back through what is today Texas, and ends up back towards the United States in Natchitoches. Of course, everybody knows that Pikes Peak is named after Zebulon Pike, but he never actually climbed the peak. He just saw it from the distance and named it after himself. But Pike's an interesting character because I think he really sort of embodies what is going on in a young American nation at this point. He's a young officer who was associated with the armies of the West. He was intimate with people like Lewis and Clark and St. Clair, the other big explorers at this time. And he had come from Ohio and Kentucky. And so again, so this idea of east looking out to the west. He had been sent by General James Wilkinson out on these two expeditions that were neither approved by Congress nor by President Jefferson. And that's important to note because these were really kind of off the book examinations of what was out in the West. And some historians have actually speculated that Pike, in fact, meant to be captured by the Spanish government and taken down across the Rio Grande into Mexico because he was out of money. These were poor men's expeditions. They were not as well funded as Lewis and Clark's. And one of the greatest ways for Pike to figure out what was going on in Spanish territory was to be captured by them, have them feed him, have them transport them before they kicked him back out of the country and sent him back to the United States. So he explored most of the Arkansas River. He was actually not supposed to be trespassing onto Spanish claimed territory, but of course he did. But it's really a result of this trip and the information that he brings back to places like St. Louis, Missouri, and eventually back to Washington, D.C., that really gets the fur trade up and running and begins to draw all kinds of Americans and Europeans out into this place that at this point is just teeming with beaver and will create a vast sort of global network and a global economy. And, just one of the last things I want to point out as we look at these maps, I think, it's really important to remember that these are trails that Europeans did not discover. It's just, they were out there bushwhacking. Pike was out bushwhacking across the Great Plains. They are using well-known trade trails, well-known transportation trails. The Native Americans had been using for generations, for hundreds of years, to conduct their own community, to conduct their own business, and create their own economic well-being. And so what you really have is people like Pike, Lewis and Clark, all these expeditions following on those trails that had long been existent in these locations. But the far western fur trade that emerges in southern Colorado is really made possible to some extent because of the knowledge that Pike brings back. And in order to overcome the problem of long distance transportation back to places like St. Louis or the Mississippi River to get these pelts back to where they needed to be, there was the creation of what was known as the rendezvous system. So a couple times a year, trappers would agree to meet in particular places to sell their goods, to get the furs back to the markets that they needed to get them back to. But one of the major things that happens as a result of this emergence of this fur trade is that trapping is now done by mostly white men rather than Native American men for very particular economic reasons. And then what we do know is that, of course, these white men came to depend very much on the labor of Indian women to process these pelts and also to help take care of them and sustain them as they're creating this vast global market. For us, probably the most important place to think about where this trade was happening was out at Bent's Fort, out on the eastern plains of Colorado. It was dominated by the Bent brothers, by the St. Frame family, Kit Carson, Carlos Beaubien, all foreigners, all immigrants who are coming to this region to help create this economy and these vast trade networks. And of course, one of the keys to their success was intermarriage, either their intermarriage with Native American women, in the case of the Bent brothers, or with local Hispano women in the case of people like Kit Carson and Carlos Beaubien. So this is a rich cultural heritage, a rich mixture that is emerging in this place. And of course, just some images here of Bent's Fort as a site of trade, not so much as it is a site of protection, but it's a site and a node of a vast global trade network here. So if we just spend a couple seconds here, look at this image. If you see Bent's Fort, which seems really out, the far edge of, what, East Coasters would think of the Western frontier. What I see is it as at the heart of a global network. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, I'm back. You have to share the screen again, Zach.
Oh, here we go. 1 second.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. You're now getting a sense of what it's like to sit in one of these classrooms where things are constantly going wrong. But the point I just want to make here is that, rather than thinking of Bedford out in the middle of nowhere in this isolated place, it actually rather we should be thinking of it as a center of commerce, right? As a center that is sending out these goods, and then bringing in all kinds of imported goods as well. Okay. There we go. And so I just want to spend a couple of minutes looking at the case of Carlos Beaubien, who was a French fur trader who moved to St. Louis, incredibly successful, married into one of the most wealthy Taos families of the Lobatos for him. And through his intermarriage and his own success, was able to gain access to 2 million acres, which is the subject of my book on the Maxwell Land Grant. And then his wife, his daughter, also married rather successfully to Maxwell, who was another fur trapper and fur trader who came in. And also I had access to a 1 million acre piece of property. And so again, I think, the point that I'm trying to make here is that rather than seeing these as isolated people or small-time farmers, these are people who are creating intimate connections through intermarriage, but using those intimate connections and leveraging them into enterprises that have a global reach, that are part of vast global networks that are developing at the early part of the 19th century. So I think, the myth of the fur trapper is that he's this guy, here's a perfect sort of image from Miller, out there by himself. He's the lone, mountain man out there. And instead, what we need to think of these fur traders as being tied to larger markets, to larger companies, and that they're entirely dependent on women and Native Americans for their labor to make them successful within that market economy. And it's also important to note at this point that this fur trade is very much a private enterprise. It's not being governed by any particular governments, whether it's the French, the Spanish, or the American governments. But it's this kind of trade network and this kind of commerce that leads to a particular kind of property wealth that emerges in the United States. Whether it's the Astor family, who gains all their, vast, amount of real estate holdings in New York City, come because of their success in the fur trade. And somebody like the Beaubiens and the Maxwells in Colorado, New Mexico, gain their own kind of real estate success and land holdings because of their early interventions into this global market. So that's sort of one of the first cases where we can think of the American Southwest and Southern Colorado as this kind of global crossroads. And the second one I want to talk about is a kind of crossroads that comes together at the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century with what I would call the industrialization of Southern Colorado and that landscape through the extraction of coal, particularly through the largest coal mining company in Colorado, CF&I, which had, employed thousands of people during this period. And this is an image of Primeto, Colorado, which is right west of Trinidad. And it gives you the sense of the kind of communities that were being built by the Rockefeller-owned enterprises. And the things I like to always point out on this are, this sort of the church here in the background. This is actually, I believe, the where the mine is. Here are the mine tailings here, and the railroad along here. And so it's a very precarious life that these families are living during this period. Rather nice homes, but a very arid landscape and a very industrialized landscape. And so I want to think a little bit about, the kinds of people that are coming to this place. CF&I drew people from all over the world, Italians, people from Southern Europe, sort of people from Central Europe. Some Mexicans came up from across the border, a few Japanese. There was a fairly significant migration of African Americans from the American South into this population. And of course, there were displaced Hispano workers who had been displaced from their land who come to work on this industrialized landscape. And I like to show this image because I think this image really goes to explaining what the Rockefellers were trying to do when they were building these community homes. Of all the groups that I mentioned and talked about immigrants who are coming to this place, most of those people came from a culture in which you lived around a plaza. You knew who your neighbors were. You gathered in a central place to have a kind of community, whether it was to gossip, to have coffee, to have, a little glass of wine at the end of the day. You always knew what was going on. You knew everybody's kids. And the geography of these coal camps is to make sure that doesn't happen. It was to separate people out into their individualized homes. In each of these little plots would have been one family. And one of the things that the Rockefeller, the CF&I did explicitly was to make sure that groups did not congregate together. So they never wanted all the Italians in one camp or in one part of the camp, or all the Greeks. So they were always mixed up. The few exceptions to this were the Japanese. There were very few Japanese miners, but they were segregated. And African Americans were often segregated within camps, or they had a separate camp at Cameron. And I could talk more about that because I could say a lot about how African Americans worked in this system. But what I want you to get a sense here is the way the community is being sort of broken up, but redefined in a way that it now circulates around the company itself. And here's sort of a typical house plan of CF&I. At the heart of this project was bringing in a group of women, mostly from the Midwest and East, who were white, if you will, or native-born Americans, who were brought into these camps to bring sort of culture and Americanization to these families. And so not only were they kindergarten teachers, but they would have been, teaching women how to cook, how to keep the proper home within these places. And one of the things that CF&I ran what was known as a Better Homes and Gardens contest for the various camps. And each camp had a couple of winners each year. And I love these images, and I really want to thank the Steelworks Museum, who has like hundreds of these pictures of these images of these homes. And it's just such a wonderful way to, it's a wonderful window into these communities. And what I like to point out when I talk about these is a way in which these homes become incredibly similar. So you have to remember, like in each one of these houses, there's a Greek family, there's an Italian family, there's a Mexican family. As we'll see, there's an African American family, but yet what it constitutes to make a home is very specific. This white picket fence here, a garden, a woman dressed in a particular way with her children out in front. The home itself is very typically American. And what we see here, is a company trying to remake these workers into their image of what an American is. Here is an African American family, and I believe this is at the Cameron camp as well. The other thing I like to point out about these photos is just how people dressed up on these days to have their picture taken by the company to do these. Now, the flip side of this, aside from the homes that are being sort of undone and remade in the image that Rockefeller and CF&I want, is the way that men are interacting with each other. And this is a picture here of the bathhouse at Primeto. And I often like to think of these bathhouses as truly the crossroads of what is going on in a particular community in one of these. This is the place that men would come at the end of the day. It was filled with bathtubs and showers and, fairly unlimited hot water because there was not often hot water inside the homes. And the idea that this was a place where men transitioned from their day of work back to their place at home. It was a place of truly sort of homosocial activity where men could interact as men with one another. I often like to think of these places as perhaps the sites of, underground union activity that was taking taking place. It might have been one of the few places in the camps that were not under strict surveillance or under the watchful eye of the superintendent. And of course, the other ways that men interacted in this space were through various kinds of camp activities and the great baseball tournaments that went out among the camps. And players would actually be traded from place to place from there. But this is a photo in 1925 at Sopris. And it's actually, I think, only about 1/3 of the whole photo. And it's a whole photo of the entire group of miners at Sopris at this time. And if you spend some time looking at it very carefully, you would get a sense of the ethnic mix of men and consequently their families that were in their spaces. And one of the things I talk about in my book is that, through Rockefeller's very basic effort to break up these communities away from their ethnicity and into the idea of the idealized industrial American worker, what he did was he actually created an identity of industrial American workers and men who now all of a sudden saw themselves as laborers, who saw themselves as having something in common with one another through their work, and tended to shift that, maybe a little bit away from their ethnic identity to having an identity as a laborer, as a worker. And that had dire consequences for the Rockefellers as the UMW and the IWW began to come into these and make inroads into the coal camps and begin to draw men away from the company union, away from the paternalism of Rockefeller, and into the idea that it was really important to have a union. And a lot of what I found in reading what these men were talking about prior to the 1927 strike is they would say, actually, we have nice homes, as you sort of seen in those earlier photos. We have, jobs. They're not always very steady, but, we do have work. But what we don't have is we're not independent. We're not men. We're not treated as men by the company. And so there's a lot of sort of gendered language around the idea of being a man and taking care of your family, and how that just cannot happen within sort of this paternalistic context of these company towns. So that's sort of the second way of thinking about the different kinds of people that are coming into this diverse place of the American Southwest. And then just the last example I want to talk about is a kind of influx of ideologies that come into southern Colorado. And in my book that's coming out next year, I talk about in the 1920s about two strains of this kind of ideology. The first strain centers around the Ku Klux Klan, which had a reemergence in the 1920s and had a very significant reemergence in Colorado, particularly in places like Denver, also in Pueblo, in the southern part of the state as well. And I spend quite a bit of time talking about the Klan and the Klan's influence in this period. But the sort of counterbalance to that sort of insertion of that kind of ideology into Colorado was the IWW, and that seems kind of weird. But one of the interesting things about the Klan in Colorado is that they weren't so necessarily anti-African American or anti-Black. What they were is very anti-immigrant, and then consequently they believed anti-communist, pro-American, and so they saw this influx of these laborers that had come in to work at the CF&I as a kind of potential infiltration of various kinds of ideologies into Colorado, particularly around communism, anarchism, and socialism. And so as the Klan sort of sets itself up against this group, the IWW, the International Workers of the World, as one of the most radical unions, sort of steps in as a counterbalance to the Klan. Now, the reason this is able to happen is because of the strict anti-union policies that had been in place throughout Colorado, and particularly by CF&I, who had kept the UMW, which was much more sort of moderate labor organization, from organizing those workers from Ludlow up until the 1920s. And so what I argue in the book is that what you really have by the 1920s is this clash of radical ideologies, sort of the Klan on one side and the IWW on the other side. This is an image from an IWW rally in 1927. I believe it's sort of like August or September of 1927. And if you could blow it up and really look at these faces here. What you would see is incredibly multi-ethnic, both genders in this crowd, and a mixture of African Americans and whites in this crowd as well. And what the IWW was really sort of posturing was this idea of that they were all workers, they were all coming together to face down these corporations, whether it was CF&I or Rocky Mountain Fuel. Again, I want to thank Steelworks Museum for all of these images. These all come out of the museum's collections there in Pueblo. This is a surveillance photograph that CF&I agents took of when they were spying on the IWW. And I just love this image. And if you flipped it over, it has all their names on the back. There are Mexican Americans here. There are obviously African Americans in this photograph. There are European immigrants here. And I think this sort of, organization of IWW leadership around this very, diverse group of labor leaders as they come together to try to bring these workers together. Again, sort of giving the sense of sort of a crossroads of ideology, but a crossroads of ethnicity, a crossroads of immigrants who are trying to make a home and trying to make a better place to work for their constituents. In all of these stories, I mean, women are just a fundamental part of whether it's making their homes inside these coal mining communities or whether they're the women out on the strike line. And this is actually a group of women picketers out on a strike line. And, often, both the state government and CF&I agents and local government officials often complained bitterly about the fact that women were out protesting. And this was from, the beginning from Ludlow and Mother Jones through the 1927 strikes at Columbine and Walsenburg. Women were at the forefront. And I love this picture because this woman right here at the front, inserted, again, this is another surveillance photograph. She was known as, I believe, Ida the Red, and red because apparently she had red hair. She loved to wear red, and of course she was a communist, right? So she was, sort of fomenting this kind of communist insurgents among the IWW. And her and a number of other sort of labor activist women are always sort of constantly at the forefront of these movements. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. They could kind of go underground. They tended to be the last ones to get arrested for their activities. They were incredibly well organized. And as men kind of circulated in and out of the jails as they were being arrested, these women could really be the heart of a strike and keep a strike going. And they were very active during the 1927 coal strikes that culminated in the Columbine massacre. This is another group of strikers who are coming through Walsen Camp, again, sort of in about November or December of 1927, at the peak of that coal strike. And I just want to end with one last image from the 1927 strike. This is an IWW rally at the Walsen Camp in Colorado, just outside of Walsenburg. And to me, it's a very poignant image. This is the labor organizer, Mauricio Vigil, who was organizing for the IWW. And he's standing next to an American flag. And I think one of the things that has always struck me when I'm looking at this strike of 1927 is the imagery of using US patriotism, using the flag as they're doing their strikes. During the Columbine massacre, which occurred during the 1927 strike, just prior to the violence that happened in Walsen, everybody made the comment that as these strikers were approaching the gate at Columbine, as they had done every morning for 2 months while they were out on strike, they were always behind the American flag, and they would sing a patriotic song. They would sort of rally themselves as, citizens or potential citizens, as people who had the right, as men who had the right to protest against their working conditions and against their employers. And so for me, when I look at this image, I think of Southern Colorado as this long history of people coming to this place from the outside, of being immigrants, of people who are trying to make their homes, whether it's in a place around Bent's Fort, whether it's on the Maxwell Land Grant or on, these other land grants in Southern Colorado, New Mexico, or if you're a family who's just getting off the train and you're a brand new worker who's coming to one of these CF&I coal camps, to these IWW radicals and workers who are trying to remake and make a home for themselves in this place that is their adopted home, and as they try to become citizens and to become worker citizens in this place. Great. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions and hear your comments.
Dr. Montoya, thank you so much for this talk. It's been really enlightening. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions so far. And as you think of questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to ask as many as we can. The first question is from Sean. She asks, do you think that the guy who sent out Zebulon Pike was also working for the Spanish government? That's a theory she's heard.
Oh, who picked up Zebulon Pike, or who sent them? I mean, I think, or Wilkinson. Yeah, the verdict is out on who Wilkinson was actually working for. And my friend and colleague Rachel St. John is writing a book on all of that right now, and just the complexity of what's going on in this region during this period. But what that does remind me of is that it's important to remember that this place was up for grabs, right? This particular place of what is today Southern Colorado, but really the Midwest, you had all kinds of people competing to take control of this region, whether it was the United States government, who's not particularly strong at this moment, the French and the Spanish, and they're often working, in cahoots with one another, or in collaboration with another, or often in conflict with one another. And so I think this is a really important moment to think about historical contingency, right? It wasn't always meant to be the United States, but that people had very different ideas in the 1820s and the 1830s about who would control this region.
The next question is from Jan. She asks about the Columbine massacre and the Ludlow massacre. Those were 13 or 14 years apart, but are there connections between the 1913-14 strike and the 1927 strike?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the connection is that in some ways it's just a continuation, right? I mean, the issues that came up at Ludlow are just never resolved. Rockefeller thinks he resolves them through the formation of the company union and the employee representation plan. And he thinks by being, a good patriarch, by being a good business owner, by taking care of these families through the creation of these coal camps, that they'll be happy workers, and they'll do what they need to do. And my sort of conclusion from looking at all this is that no matter how much he thought he was trying to make workers happy, and he thought he was trying to make their workplace better, the fact that they had no real say in how they ran their lives or how they ran their workplace never allowed them to be satisfied. And you see over and over again, when men talk about this, they talk about how they don't feel like men, how they're not treated as individuals, how they're not treated as people who have ownership and property over their own work and their own body within the context of CF&I. And so I think, what Rockefeller tries to do ends up just sort of being really a band-aid over what is a long, long legacy of industrial violence in Colorado that stretches from the end of the 19th century, until the 1930s, when it's finally, to some extent, resolved with the passage of the Wagner Act. So for me, Columbine in 1927 is just really a reckoning of what had not been dealt with as a result of Ludlow before that.
Great, thank you. Don asks, what was the relationship between the United Mine Workers and the IWW?
Oh, that's just, I love that. I could talk for an hour about that. The United Mine Workers, who are an AFL affiliate, for the most part, had been completely kept out of Colorado in terms of organizing miners after Ludlow. Rockefeller was vehemently anti-union, and he got the other coal operators to go along with that. And Rockefeller would say, yeah, sure, you can have a union, you can have union representation, but it just was never allowed to foster. At the same time, the UMW really kind of gives up on Colorado for the most part. By the early part of the 1920s, they're not putting the money or the resources into organizing these mine workers. They just don't feel like it's a payoff for them. And so they have very, very little success in Colorado, and nor do they really try to have a lot of success in Colorado. Consequently, the IWW just steps into what is a void of union organization in the middle part of the 1920s. And it's kind of ironic because pretty much everywhere else in the United States, the IWW is just about dead as a doornail. It's just seen as too radical, as they infight too much, they can't decide what they're doing. But for this brief moment in Colorado, they have a resurgence in which they are really able to organize workers, to get them rallied behind the deaths of Sacco and Vanzetti. That becomes a real rallying point for the IWW. And of course, while the IWW is not successful at all, they can't, they themselves don't even know if they want to, they don't, they say they don't want a contract because they're radicals. They want to take over all the means of production. They don't want to negotiate with, with Rocky Mountain or with Colorado Fuel. But it's because of that radicalism that finally allows the UMW to step in and to get a contract with Rocky Mountain Fuel, because it's just a situation of like, you don't want the IWW on your back door and you don't want to deal with them. Well, then you should be dealing with the more reasonable, UMW and John Lewis. And certainly, we could spend a lot of time talking about Josephine Roche, but Josephine Roche is willing to make that contract and to deal directly with the United Mine Workers. Rockefeller is not, right? CF&I never signs that UMW contract until it is forced to as a result of the Wagner Act in the 1930s.
Was Rocky Mountain, was that Josephine Roche's company?
Yeah, Rocky Mountain Fuel was controlled through a board of directors, of which her father had been one of the major shareholders. And when he dies, just in early part of 1927, late 1926, she takes control eventually of the company and attempts to put her own progressive notions about labor and workers into play by palling up with John Lewis and recognizing the UMW.
Moya asks, how did women have the chance to come together in some organized way as men miners were organizing?
I think, women have different ways of organizing and thinking about what their roles are in this. Obviously there are no women miners, right? They're not in the physical workplace doing the actual labor of mining. But none of this work gets done, and this is not a successful enterprise except for the fact that women are living and doing unpaid labor in these places, right? They are the people who are keeping homes. They're the people, you see those gardens. Those gardens are not for beauty. You know, those gardens are to feed your family or to have some kind of trade network with your neighbor, and maybe you keep a few chickens and you have, you know, some eggs, and you have a cow for milking. You know, there's a whole economy that's going on inside of these places, and they're creating their own kind of community. You know, and you know how radicalized that is. That's difficult for us to tell. But what we do know is that when strikes happened and people got kicked out of their company housing, it was women who were at the forefront. You know, they're the ones who are packing up and organizing their family and helping to organize men to keep the picket lines going. And when they needed to, they would be the ones who would be out on the picket line. And it was often much more effective for wives to be out on the picket line because both, you know, Pinkerton agents, government agents tended to, you know, shy away from, you know, beating women who were out on the picket lines, and women use that to their advantage. They could be very successful in sort of, you know, picking up a strike that was lagging at a time. And what, you know, as one of the images I show there, I love that. You know, they always dressed up. You know, if they had anything nice, and you know, they would dress up to go on the strike because they were out in public. Doing their work. But these are not women who scare easily, right? I mean, these are women who will take care of their families and then head out to the picket line and face down a horse and face down government agents and face down guns to make sure that a strike stays in place.
And then I think probably the last question we'll have time for is from Mimi, who asks, when these jobs left Southern Colorado, I think as the coal mines closed, where do these former miners end up?
Well, I guess I could just write a third book about this. I mean, this book really came out of my Maxwell Land Grant book. And when, you know, at the end of the Maxwell Land Grant book, I was like, oh my gosh, all these people got displaced from their land. You know, where did they go? They had been farmers. They had been making that kind of life for themselves there. And, you know, and the obvious answer was they had moved to this industrialized landscape of Southern Colorado. I mean, you know, people in your audience probably know better than I do what happened to those people, right? I know from, you know, from my family, you know, for the most part, people moved to Denver, they moved to Albuquerque, they moved to places, to more urban locations where there were jobs for them to do, whether it was in the service industry or another kind of industry. And I think what's always interesting in a lot of these communities, what you see is people, you know, returning home at retirement, right? So it's like they've been away, they've made their money, they've raised their families, and you'll often sort of see a kind of return back to these locations for them. People adapt, you know, and I think we adapt and we go to all these different places, but in the end, you know, this is the place we call home, and I think people always have that kind of connection back to that place.
Well, if we can, we have one more really great question from Don about the surveillance photos. Who was actually taking those photos? Were they CF&I employees, or were they contractors? Were they Pinkertons? Do we know?
They were CF&I employees who would often be, let me see if I can pull back one up, who would infiltrate into these unions. And I think Jonathan Rees has a really lovely piece about these photos, these exact photos. I think it's in the Colorado Historical magazine, which is just terrific, and he really pulls them apart. But you know, they were, I think it's Agent X, Agent XX, and Agent, you know, Triple X. You know, not exactly the most thoughtful names to put on your surveillance agents. But they had infiltrated into the unions. They often acted, you know, to instigate from the inside. Often, I think, certainly with the violence that takes place at Walsen out in the 1927 strike, just after the Columbine massacre. To some extent, I think that violence is being sort of fomented from within, from CF&I agents who have infiltrated into those unions to make them look more radical, to make them look more dangerous, to really try to get public opinion to shift against union organization. So constantly sort of portraying the IWW as outsiders, as foreigners, as communists, as radicals, to really try to, to put an end to that kind of union organization. And to some extent, the UMW steps into that and says, we can work, with CF&I, we can work with Roche and Rocky Mountain Fuel. We're not communists, we're not outsiders. We're Americans, and we can sort of bring this kind of industrial peace finally by the end of the 1920s.
Sorry, I was on mute. I was saying thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I'm so happy we were finally able to.
I'm glad this worked out. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everyone who was able to join us this evening. Our next Borderlands talk is, I made a typo. The next Borderlands talk is Tuesday, April 27th at 6. It's going to be with Donda Prince, who's the lead developer of the Borderlands of Southern Colorado initiative, talking about the making of Borderlands of Southern Colorado, exhibits and programs, specifically in the exhibit that just opened at the History Colorado Center. You can register for that free talk at h-co.org/borderlands talks. And again, I'm sorry about the typo. It's Tuesday, April 27th. You can also get Dr. Montoya's book, Translating Property, at the History Colorado Bookshop. That's at historycolorado.org/translating property. And through the weekend, we're offering $10 off on our Borderlands bundles on our shop at h-co.org/borderlands bundle. And I will send all of these links in the follow-up email to this. Thank you again to everyone who joined us tonight. As always, we want to thank the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area and CSU Pueblo, to all of our donors and members, especially Fronteras members who are supporting History Colorado museums and programs. Dr. Montoya, thank you. And everyone, we'll see you in a couple of weeks on the 27th. Have a good evening.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Eric. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.